Good morning and welcome. We are so glad to have you all here with us this morning for this very important topic. My name is Amanda Nickerson. I am a professor of school psychology and director of the Alberti Center for Bullying Abuse Prevention here at the University at Buffalo. And I'm really pleased to be joined by our excellent panel this morning. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but we have Michael Gilberg, who we can give credit for having this event because he contacted us and said, this is a really important issue, which we did know, but you really, it should do something on this. We also have Tara Moffitt, excellent school attorney representing school districts. Michael Gilberg is also an attorney representing families and children. And then Steve Oil, who is a family peer advocate, so has a wealth of perspective as a parent and also as an advocate working with others. So without further ado, I'm actually going to hand it over to our panelists. I've asked each of them to just introduce themselves a little bit more and then tell us more about their work as it relates to bullying and students with disabilities. Before I do that, just a couple housekeeping items. Is that we are planning to go until 12:45. I think we will actually be running out of time, believe it or not, because there's such a wealth of information that our panelists have. We have several questions that we received when people registered, and we are going to ask as many of those as possible. But we also want you to feel free to put questions in the chat. Just so you know, only the panelists will be able to see those questions. We're doing that to protect your privacy because this is also being recorded and we don't want, your private information going out. Having said that, if you could try to refrain from using specific names of people or districts when you're asking your question, we really want to keep this more not specific cases, but more general information for people on these issues. If you do have sort of a clarifying question, if we're using an acronym or something that you don't quite understand, we'll get that. We'll be able to see that and we'll be able to clarify on the spot. But otherwise, we will probably wait for those questions more towards the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's hand it over to Michael first for introduction and telling us more about yourself and your role with regard to this topic.
Sure. My name is, as Amanda said, my name is Michael Gilberg. I'm a special education attorney representing families in special education proceedings when they have issues, challenges with their school district, don't feel that children are getting appropriate services or need different services or an out-of-district placement or similar, or in many cases, bullying and cases like that with children with disabilities. So my job is when the parents in the school district break down to get hired and contact the school board attorney like Tara to work with them to try to resolve it. As I say, Tara and I are adversaries, but we're not ever adversarial with each other.
Fair enough.
With that, I'll hand it to Tara.
Okay. My name is Tara Moffitt. I'm a partner with Gervin and Ferlazzo. We are a law firm that represents about 70 different school districts throughout the state of New York. In my capacity, my primary focus is all things special ed. And within that context, we do a lot of policy reviews, development, strategies, working with our districts to make sure that they're complying. And obviously, with the advent of the Dignity for All Students Act, in addition to addressing disability-related needs and issues, we also have done a lot of work with our districts regarding the Dignity for All Students Act, that's DASA, or some people will just call it DASA, that would be me, where it really talks about addressing bullying, harassment, and discrimination against individuals on a variety of different categories. I've worked with districts to develop policies, procedures, investigation, forms, and all of the steps from beginning to end with the hope that we can promptly address and resolve bullying issues, and then also continue to remediate and help get those students back on track and hopefully promote a positive and healthy learning environment for everyone.
Thank you, Tara. Steve, would you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I just have to share that all morning I didn't have to talk to anybody. And now I'm getting a little raspy in my throat. I'm drinking tea. I have a cough drop. It'll be fine in about 10 minutes, I'm sure. My name's Steve Oil. I live in the Capital Region, New York State. And as a family peer advocate, there's a few things that we do, but a lot of it, and the most tangible, is to do advocacy, systems advocacy, and mostly educational advocacy, because that's what most of the call is for, that we get called for, is educational advocacy. I've been in human services since 1987, when I had a nice head of hair. And I did all kinds of things in human services, worked at a shelter, worked in residential care. But it wasn't until my son, who is now 24, when he was born and diagnosed at age 2.5. So about 20 years ago, a little more than that, where I eventually found a calling to doing advocacy and family support. I love the other stuff that I did before that, but this is the most passionate I've been about work in my adult life. I share that because I'm also half Italian, and I often wear my emotions on my sleeve. I quickly found out that it's not a good combination, advocacy and emotions at full blast. Found out the hard way with our first transition meeting from EI, early intervention, to CPSA. And then I started getting trained and I started working professionally. And I think one role that the advocates have, I just want to share, that I've learned, and what I try to do in my work, is, as Michael pointed out, when you have lawyers involved, it's almost defined as an adversarial relationship when you bring lawyers in. When you have advocates, it doesn't have to be that, at least not at the outset. It might become adversarial, but our goal is to try to not make it adversarial and try to do what the law states, which is meet the needs of this disabled child in terms of special ed. So today, I hope my experience and my training, along with my comrades on the panel here, can impart some ideas and wisdom maybe you've not heard before, to help us all come to the table in terms of bullying students with disabilities and how to help that to happen less and to be addressed more quickly when it happens.
Thank you all so much. I'm sure you can see why we invited these three speakers. A lot of expertise and representing different viewpoints as well, yet still working together toward the same goal. So I'm going to start out with our first.
Amanda, just as we start, I want to note that while some of what we're going to say will be general to all bullying in schools in general, there will be things that, based on our own experience, will be specifically New York. Specifically New York law, specifically New York outside of New York City. I just want to note, New York City system is a very different system than the rest of the state.
Thank you. Okay, Michael, I'm going to start this first question with you. Can you tell us about some of the bullying issues involving the students and families with whom you work? Just for example, are there certain types of bullying or particular disabilities that seem to be subject to this the most?
Well, in my experience, and maybe it's because of my own background, as I don't remember if I said in my intro, I grew up with undiagnosed Asperger's, so I get a lot of autism cases. And there seem to be a lot of children on the spectrum facing bullying because, as their peers will say, they're weird or they're strange. So it leads to more likely to be bullied than, say, your kid who has a learning disability. Somebody's more likely to bully a child who they think is unusual or strange than somebody who just can't read. So I see a lot of them with autism cases, some with mental health cases where the kid's, acting out and they can't control their behavior. So I see those a lot. Occasionally ADHD because they're impulsive. And what you'll get is you get impulsive children who are calling out, they're interrupting the class, and their peers don't like it and they don't know how to handle it appropriately. So the issues I generally see are kids, hitting each other, making fun of each other, calling other kids weird or freaks or stuff like that, or kids in general saying things that, making fun of the kids for being different, for lack of a better term.
Okay, thank you. Steve, do you want to tell us more about the bullying issues that you see with the students and families that you work with?
Excuse me. Yeah. And kind of where Michael left off, I think one of the things I'm thinking that I experience a lot is, a lot of disabled students' peers are good kids and they want to do the right thing. Sometimes they don't know how to do that, and sometimes they just target other kids, and it might be more subtle than even the things that Michael was just talking about. It could be something like a peer saying to them, and it has been this, saying something like, what's wrong with you? Or like, and usually it's contextual into the moment, like walking in the halls, bumping into someone, and then somebody with mental health issues gets posed that question, well, what's with you? And to most of us, kind of like the whole problem before DASA came out in 2012, it's just like a rite of passage. Like, kids just tease a lot, but it's more than that, especially if it's relating to disability, and especially if a student knows a peer for a long time. So if they know the disabled peer their whole life, they're in 5th grade, usually even in the subtlest ways, they kind of know that they're different. And that vulnerability is the real problem for the parents as well as the students. So in a way, I just wanted to review quickly kind of there's a lot of things that constitute bullying. I just want to run through a very short list of some of those things, because I think that it'll help us kind of remember that it's bullying and not just a rite of passage. Name calling, taunting, threats or teasing, blocking someone's path. That used to happen to me a lot. I remember I figured kids just getting in my way because they thought it was funny. That's not okay. Holding or touching someone or pushing someone, spitting on someone, stealing. So taking something. So remember, like, someone took your books and played, what was the name of that game? Try to get it back from me. I can't remember the right name.
Keep away.
Keep away.
Keep away. So it seemed all innocent, but that's really a bullying thing. So I get a lot of that. And with Michael's reference to people with autism, there's a lot of dual diagnosed kids or symptoms that cross over, both that are mental health or with autism, in terms of anxiety, social anxiety, wanting to be social but not knowing how to do it. So I get a lot of those things. And that's kind of my starting point with a lot of families and a lot of students is, well, first we have to talk with the school and make sure they know what's happening before it can even be addressed. So I don't want to get too more deep unless you have another question to that, Amanda, but that's kind of what I was experiencing.
Thank you. Yeah, and just because a lot of folks on this have probably been to our other talks, so they may be thinking, wait, he's listing a bunch of things that they may not say are bullying, because we very much go by the definition of having it be aggression that's repeated or highly likely to be repeated in a power imbalance. But I do want to remind everybody that we are talking about DASA here, which is harassment, which is actually quite a wider net than what we would consider that very strict definition of bullying. So I just wanted to put that in there. But as a follow-up,
sorry, let me add to that, because the term, this was raised to me last night by others about this, the term microaggressions. Like, as you said, it's not always what we think in the big things. There can be little things that are called microaggressions.
Yes, thank you. I think we have a question related to microaggressions in a bit too. Steve, just a follow-up to what you were talking about. What would the parents that you represent or advocate for like to see happen if their child experiences bullying? What are they looking for?
First thing I thought about this a lot before today. And the first thing I thought is that I experience and hear from parents in one way or another is they would really, first of all, just like it, that it never happened. Wish that it would never happen. That's the first thing. And I think that's an important point, because it's often happening to parents of kids with disabilities a lot more than most typically developing students. Then the next thing that they are looking for is justice. And I say that almost tongue in cheek because that's like their first response, that emotional response, which is extremely valid, that they want justice. And I say that because for each parent, justice is different. Or when they start to talk it through with you or with me in this example, and they start to calm a bit and they realize that I'm going to be able to help them, and they feel a little safer, then usually they're a little calmer, and justice often comes down a little bit. It's not, I want that kid to feel like my kid feels, or whatever other venting they might say. So I think those two things are really important. And what's great about DASA and trying to change our culture in our country from that bullying is okay to bullying is not okay. It's not a rite of passage. What's great about this is DASA really partners up well with what I just described, those feelings that parents have. So as an advocate, I can come in and they may have heard of DASA, but I can explain, like, how many times I say, well, what does the school know? And they're like, well, my child won't tell them. I'm like, okay, well, you can tell them. And also you should put it in writing, whether it's an email or whatever else. So there's a lot of action that comes from just notifying people in school that what's happening and putting it in writing. I also noticed that no matter what your district culture is, if you put it in writing, you're going to get a response relatively quick. People take that more seriously than a phone call. It's easier to go into your old values or mores, perhaps, with a phone call. But in writing, it's almost like I have to respond to this somehow, but I talk to my supervisor, or I know what to do, I'm going to do it. So I don't know, does that answer your question? That's kind of what parents are looking for.
It does. Thank you. And I see that we got a question in the chat. I think it goes back to when we were talking about what bullying is. And the person asked, would a succinct way of framing DASA for our population is discriminatory bullying as it's on account of their disability? So I wonder what people think about that.
I was just going to weigh in on that because you may be a student with a disability who may be targeted not because of your disability. You could be targeted for another reason, or it could be disability related. So I don't think it precludes the possibility that they could target you because you're a girl or because you're a boy or because you are transgender, as well as disabled. Their approach of what they're targeting may be different, but you being the recipient may have multiple responses based on all of the different aspects of who you are. And sometimes the bullying is not exclusive to disability, where, let's be honest, some people are real universal, hate givers, and they will just hit every category and, engage a peer with, really cross-dimensional offense. End of the day, the bigger question is, what can we do in terms of DASA is recognizing that one way or another, kids are entitled to be safe and healthy and happy at school. And if those issues come up, it's not really for the child to try to figure out why it's wrong. Let us know what the problem is, and we can hopefully try to help you get some, remedy, relief, investigation, follow through, depending upon the circumstance and what happens.
Right. I think following on Tara, I've said this before, sometimes bullying is not necessarily, you can have a disability, but it's not because of a disability. I've seen kids who honestly, and I know this as somebody on the spectrum, people on the spectrum, sometimes they just bring it on themselves. Not usually, but there are cases where people with autism can be jerks. I always use the example of Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. Even though it's not explicitly stated, Sheldon is most likely on the spectrum and he's just a jerk. And he's written to be that way. It's a great example, I think. I think also I've seen schools say that where they've justified it by saying, and this doesn't make it right, but this is a new defense. I've seen schools say, well, this kid's an equal opportunity bully. He's not bullying your kid because he's disabled. He's bullying all the kids just because that's who he is. He's a jerk.
Yeah, that's not a good answer for a district to give. if we know someone who's specifically bullying and targeting, regardless of who they're targeting, once they've been identified, we should be working as a district to address and try to intervene, educate, remediate, and work with the student, because, the fact that they have patterns of bullying is more concerning to me as to what are we doing to intervene and to try to change that pattern or practice.
And perhaps I can, I just want to close, if I could close it out or whatever. I agree with Tara and Michael wholeheartedly, as my first impulse was, how do you know it's a disability? However, to add to this and give it a little dimension, one of my first trainings I went to about discipline in the Part 201 regulations, the example that was given was that a student, in terms of manifestation, which write to me, I'll tell you about it if you don't know about it already. In terms of that, it was about a student with a very intense cognitive disability, very likable. The image in my head, they never said it, was probably a student with Down syndrome, and that students in the high school were selling drugs. But when the teacher or someone saw them, they gave a bag of the drugs and handed it to this nice disabled student. So the kid got in trouble, of course, and it was an example of how it was a manifestation of a disability, and it was not his fault. But I think that's a good example, maybe back to the person's question in the chat box, that if you have more information specific to your case or to a case or to a student that really leans towards this is really about the disability, I think in that example, you sure could call it what you said, but the remedy is still the same as what Michael and Tara said. Regardless of what you call it or how you define it, you still want to get it to the school's attention and to point it out that this is not okay and it's not fair and it's not right.
Thank you. We've started to touch on this, but Tara, could you tell us a little bit more about what you've seen schools do well to prevent and intervene with bullying for students with disabilities?
I think that first and foremost, you really need to make sure that the district has a clear process for who parents or kids go to, how they make a report, making sure that that's user friendly. So making sure that if we're asking people to submit a complaint or a report, that you can find it, that it's available on your website, it's in the offices. The students can go to a person or persons to get that form. And also we encourage districts to consider having a box where complaints can be anonymously submitted. It may impact how quickly or easily we can investigate, but it does also allow for people who have been unwilling to come forward to at least put forward the potential for that issue. So making the process easy and user-friendly is important. The second is sending the right message. Districts should be promoting, one, they're legally required to. At the beginning of every year, they must review DASA and the expectations of non-harassment, non-bullying, and that the district will not tolerate those behaviors. Now, it's one thing to say it and, check it off the list. It's another thing to live it. And it really should be part of the ongoing message from the school and from the community that we do take harassment, discrimination, and bullying seriously. So how do we do that as districts? What information do you put up? What are you publicizing in your halls? What announcements are you giving every day? Some districts have, a champion of the day announcement where they talk about how, this person triumphed over this circumstance and this person, gave of themselves and donated time, where they kind of recognize the kindness and the giving of others. And it's also in terms of the curriculum and the material we cover in our character education programs. Those are also part of the message that the district can send universally when there are incidents of harassment and discrimination, to say, this is the message we want you to understand. We want to promote tolerance. We want you to understand that you may not like everybody, but you need to be polite and civil to them. And to make sure that we as staff and teachers and district representatives are also modeling those behaviors. So how a teacher interacts with a student is an example of a positive opportunity to demonstrate when we disagree, how we can disagree appropriately. And vice versa. And those are some of those. The other part is really the investigation process. What districts needs to do well is when a complaint comes in is to act upon it. There's two steps that I always say. Complaint comes in, first thing you want to do is arrange to interview the complainant who is bringing the complaint. And sometimes that is the parent makes the complaint, but it's on behalf of the student, depending upon the student's capacity, we need to find out what happened and get as many details as possible. So that can give us, the context, the circumstance, the timing, so that we can sort of start to get a better picture of what happened. I do a lot of training with districts on doing an unbiased interview, being open, asking open-ended questions, letting the student speak and not making any presumptions. And also extremely important, interview them separately from other people. They should not be an earshot, eye shot, or whatever of the person that they may be reporting on, because if someone sees them go in and then they get called down to the office, of course, it's going to be, oh, well, so-and-so just, ratted me out. And the other is promote an attitude that it's not tattling. It's being a good citizen, letting people know if there's an issue or a concern. And then last, but certainly not least, having a reasonable timeline and making sure that we complete those investigations. And during the investigation, and this is really where I think the difference between a district handling a situation well and a district just handling a situation is, once you've identified the problem, the second question after you've interviewed the student is, how is this affecting you? And what do you think you need, to allow us to get a sense of what possible intervention or interim supports we might need to do to help and support that student while we're doing the investigation. And I think that really, developing those interim steps or remedial measures is really important. And sometimes in our haste to get the facts, that gets kind of put to the wayside. But to me, that's really what parents want to hear first and foremost. What are you doing now to support my child? I get it, and I want you to investigate, but right now I have an unhappy child and I don't know where you're going to go with this. What can you do? So if the child says, I'm afraid in the cafeteria, I'm afraid to be in a locker room, I'm not comfortable being in on the bus with this student, we may have to look at what can we do to address or support the child during those circumstances while we're investigating. And then after you conclude, you then determine what other remedial measures, if any, are needed to address the situation after the fact. And I say, regardless of whether you find that there was an incident of harassment or bullying, you're almost always going to recommend counseling and check-ins with that student, because one way or the other, they need to feel safe and they need to know that there is a network of support that the district has to help and address them and their concerns. And sometimes just having that, knowing someone is going to ask you or check in with you, can really help reassure that student that I'm under the watch. I know someone's keeping an eye on me, so I've got a backup plan and support. And I think that those are really the biggest things that are part of what districts need to do well in order to handle these situations properly.
I think Tara hits the nail on the head about some of the places that we see bullying or incidents occur. Generally, they don't generally occur in the classroom during a lesson. The locker room is a big place. School buses. I see a lot of these incidents happening in school buses where there might be an aide on the bus, but they're not watching every student with 30 students on the bus. School buses tend to be a place I see a lot of these issues developing.
And lunchroom, cafeteria, hallways, waiting for the bus before and after. Those are also common elements. And for the younger kids, recess, always recess.
True.
Yeah. Now, you spoke about the process, and we had a question that said, who is the first contact, particularly if you have a complaint about bullying with a student with a disability? For example, is it the psychologist, the principal, the DASA coordinator?
Well, realistically, whoever you report it to is supposed to notify and refer the issue over within 24 hours and submit a written report within 48 hours. But the best typical, reporting source is usually the building administrator. They may then follow up or have the counselor or the psychologist or social worker assist them in the investigation, simply because they may be the DASA coordinator for the building. And typically that's what districts have used, is that they may have one or two administrators per building that serve as their DASA coordinator, and then their backup DASA coordinator in the event of conflict or someone being unable to proceed. But it doesn't matter the process, but the best approach is to submit something to the administrator, preferably in writing, and to make available the child as soon as possible so that we can get more information. Because oftentimes parents are, but I told you what happened. And we're not dismissing the parents' version of events, but the reality is that they weren't there. And the student may be able to say, I don't know the name of the kid, but I can tell you I know he's in Miss Smith's class. And that gives us more information, whereas the parent's not going to know those details. They'll only know that the student was unhappy about this circumstance, and we need to kind of figure out who are we investigating, where are we going, and those details often involve speaking with the student.
Thank you. We had a few questions, a couple questions submitted.
Uh-oh, Amanda froze a minute.
Amanda's frozen for a moment, but we'll hopefully.
So I wonder, Michael, if you could tell
Amanda,
us.
just repeat what you said. You froze for a moment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're back now, though. So
I'm back
So whatever
now.
your question was, if you could repeat it, we will be happy to answer it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just saying we had a couple questions from registrants about IEPs, individualized education programs, and bullying. So, Michael, I wonder if you could tell us, do you advocate that issues related to bullying be included in a child's IEP? And if so, can you give us an example of how this might be addressed?
Sure. When we're practical, we try to write things into the IEP about bullying, say that the child has a history of bullying. The IEP offers you flexibility. And I see many IEPs talk about histories of bullying or cases where the parents have raised concerns. It depends where and how you do it. I think you write it in more narratively. You can have goals, though, for social skills or ways to avoid bullying. Like if this kid knows, that being in certain place, if we know that at a certain place at a certain time could lead to bullying, you have a goal to maybe not let the child not to put himself in that situation. That, if he knows student X is going to bully him, and I'm not sure Tara and I would work on that if we were doing a case that, because you can't name other students in the IEP, but a goal to avoid certain students, perhaps not walk next to him in the hallway, not go near him in the cafeteria without naming the other student. Something like avoiding student X, but not naming him, obviously.
I think a lot of when we talk about bullying and harassment issues in an IEP, for me, it's not usually going to necessarily use the word bullying, but it's really the characteristics or the strategies that we want students to be able to use. So for example, for a student who's had a hard time coming forward and relating these issues, we work with them on self-advocacy, whether it's through counseling or social skills, to be able to report an issue or a concern, helping kids be able to work on self-esteem, being able to connect with others, being able to identify good things about themselves, because their self-concept is really going to impact how others see them and how they see themselves. Social skills, really understanding that hidden curriculum of communication, how to interact, what is and isn't potentially, quote unquote, age appropriate. If you're in, elementary school and you're talking about SpongeBob SquarePants, everyone's okay with it. When you're still talking about it in middle and high school, when we're too cool for school, then, that's no longer considered appropriate. And so helping kids understand some of those, again, Michelle Garcia Winner's hidden curriculum strategies, and then perspective taking. There often are incidents where kids may be victim of bullying and at the same point also may have difficulty perceiving what is harassment and bullying versus what may not be. So, an example is kids are rushing down the hall. Somebody knocks into the student and they drop their books on the floor and they keep rushing because they're trying to get to class. The student feels that he's just been, attacked by someone who threw his books to the floor and then walked away without concern. The question is was that bullying in intent? Was that a kid who was in a mad rush to get to class? Was that nice? Absolutely not. But being able to look at perspective, was that the only way you could look at that? And again, I am not suggesting bullying does not happen, because it does. But I do think that with some kids, the perspective taking is an important part to be able to parcel out between what might not be super nice, but doesn't rise to the level of bullying. And also how to advocate for yourself, how to say, I don't think that was nice. I wish you wouldn't say that. And then last but not least, empathy. We really work with a lot of kids to be able to empathize. Sometimes we have kids who are both the victim and the bully simultaneously, and they don't necessarily always understand how my comment may upset you, and then you react, and then I'm upset by your comment. and being able to kind of put those pieces together, all of those things are things that I would put in an IEP, as well as problem solving and conflict resolution. So I think a lot of the skills go in, and some concerns about peers who may be easily misled or who may be, overly reliant upon peer perception may be part of it. But really our goal is to figure out what tools do you need as part of your IEP to help you be able to manage, navigate, and otherwise be safe in school, or get assistance if there's a problem.
Well, and I think jumping on what Tara said, sometimes, what somebody sees as bullying might not actually be bullying. Two football players are throwing things in the hallway and they bump into a kid with autism and the kid gets knocked over. He might say, well, they hit me, but really it was an accident because they were goofing around doing what they shouldn't have been doing in the hallway. Or what I find, what Tara said, sometimes we don't know what's going on in someone's life, and we can say something without realizing it's offending them because it hits a touchy spot for them, or it touches a nerve.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Another question related to the IEP and bullying is sort of, what are student rights if they have an IEP, if they have a 504 with regard to bullying? I guess the question is more like, are there different rights or specific rights or any different procedures for documentation of bullying if a student does have an IEP or a 504 plan?
I think the biggest concern is access to FAPE, a free appropriate public education. If you have a 504 or an IEP, you're entitled to be able to access or participate in, school programs and activities, including your IEP services. If, as a result of bullying, you're missing school, you're skipping classes, you're missing your instruction, then the issue is the impact of bullying can affect the FAPE. And so it's not a difference of documentation, but it is a question of what will go before the CSE or the 504 team to determine, do we need to A, remediate any lost access to programs and services, and B, do we need to provide additional accommodations or support or counseling or something else to help the student kind of get over that circumstance? And then last but not least, going back to the skill set I talked about previously, probably looking at some of those different skills to determine, do we need to do something different, more particular to the student, to help make sure that they'll let us know if there's a problem so that they can continue to access FAPE.
Well, and I think some of that gets into, if there's something the student needs for their disability and somebody's bullying them, like I've heard cases where they take the blind kid's cane away. I mean, that sounds horrible, but that would be a case where it would affect his ability to access his education if he doesn't have his assistive device. Or as Tara said, it causes the student not to come to school.
Right. Or alternatively, if you have a student who has a food allergy and the other kids are taunting, saying, I'm going to sneak peanut butter into your food, now the kid won't eat, and they're terrified because they're afraid that, that is absolutely bullying, and then that's bullying based on the disability.
And they could end up in the hospital.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So those are circumstances where, it might absolutely result in the student missing school, skipping school, or otherwise being unable to participate. And that may be where the district has to look at, do you provide tutoring? Do you provide makeup services? Do you provide compensatory education? Can we, have the student do like a temporary resource room to kind of catch up? There are different ways you can approach it, all based on the unique circumstances of the student. But my first question to every district is, where's the student? When we receive an investigation and complaint, it's, where's the student now? Are they home? Are they in school? Well, the parent hasn't sent them for 3 days. Okay. Have we reached out to the parent and talked about what can we do? Are they returning the student with a safety plan, or do we need to talk about a short term of tutoring while we look into this? Because the last thing you want is the kids to miss out on instruction and services. And the quicker you can complete the investigation, the better. But if it may not be something you can wrap up in a day, you need to have a plan as to how do we keep making sure the student can access the program and education and services.
Thank you. So we've mentioned DASA, the Dignity for All Students Act, a few times, and you have been practicing longer than pre-DASA and post-DASA. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about how DASA has affected bullying of students with disabilities and your own work in this area. Tara, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. To me, DASA just added another layer with, of issues that may rise to the level of the need for specific CSE review for issues that may impact a faith. So, we might have two parallel tracks. There's the building level intervention and support and investigation into DASA, and then there's the CSE or 504. Now, the CSE or 504 is not necessarily investigating and determining what are we doing or how do we respond, but they're looking at the individual needs of the student saying, okay, there's this DASA investigation, there's these bullying claims. What do we need to do to help you as a student be able to move forward? Do we need to do counseling? Do we need to provide, additional support? Do we need to look at compensatory services? So DASA is just, to me, for special ed purposes, has really created a parallel framework of what the building does and what the CSE does. There was a famous case that came out a couple of years ago called TK. And really one of the biggest things in that case showed was the district said, hey, DASA and bullying, we handle those at the building level. That never comes to the CSE. And the court said, oh no, my friend. If it's interfering with the student's ability to access faith, then it absolutely can be addressed in a CSE meeting. So when a parent raises an issue of harassment or bullying at CSE meetings, we need to have discussion about what, if anything, we need to do. And again, it's not going to be, as Michael said, it's not going to be listing the names of kids who we think are bullies that we don't want to have proximity, but we might have an agreement that the student may need to be, placed in groups that do not necessarily include certain people who may be, he may be prone to have difficulties with, or other strategies that would be helpful to support the student educationally, that would be separate and apart from what might be happening at the building level to, remediate the harassment or bullying and to get the kid back on track academically. We're still talking about the individual in the IEP to make sure that we address the individual needs of the student.
I'm going to ask an question.
So what Tara said. While DASA is not a disability-specific law, it plays in a lot, like Tara said, and especially because kids with disabilities do tend to be bigger targets. I mean, the kid with autism is more likely to be the victim of bullying than the quarterback of the football team. It's just the reality of the world we're in.
To piggyback off this a little bit,
Oh, we're frozen again.
The remediation or modifying things so that the student with the disability is avoiding the other person or in another situation. I hear a lot from parents of students with disabilities or others that have been victimized that they feel like that's blaming the victim, and that really what the school should be doing is changing the schedule or the environment of the person perpetrating it. Just wonder if you have any thoughts or reactions to that.
Well, Steve, I'll let you weigh in because I know what your thoughts are, and then I'll give you the district's perspective.
Okay, thank you, Tara. I think I agree with that notion. I don't stay there, but I agree with that notion. Like, why blame the victim? We don't want to do that. I want to point out to our previous discussion we just had, aside from DASA, I find that generally speaking, the school psychologists, the school social workers, and the school guidance counselors, especially the social workers and the psychologists, because they're innate parts of the CSE most of the time, that they often will be looking at these things. Especially, I think it's easier in elementary school, but I see it in high school too, where they want to either mediate or try to help repair, especially if it's a peer that you've known a long time. So even if they're not good friends, but they know they're going to see each other for the next 3-4 years, they're going to try and work through that for both parties, which I think is a very positive thing. So I mentioned that because, as Tara said, how DASA kind of complements IDEA and whatnot, and I agree. And I think that's an example. I want to give a shout out to all the social workers and the psychologists on that, because I think that's it's pragmatic. As if not, it's a lot of things. It certainly starts with pragmatic. In terms of in terms of blaming the victim, or what do you do? In terms of changing culture, an ounce of prevention. What's the old saying? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think I know at least one district, and maybe there's probably others. You change culture when you promote. It's easy to start at elementary school levels because kids are younger and they're more flexible. But if you can promote like integration and inclusion, even with I hate to use this phrase, the kids that the disability is the most visible, whether it be on the autism spectrum, whether it be a mental health issue, Tourette's kind of thing, but whatever it is, the more you include kids in the specials and the concerts, the building concerts at the holidays and whatnot, singing and playing instruments, the more you include that, the more normal it becomes, the more regular it is, and it's not different. So you have kids growing up like that, they see disabled peers as part of their community, not as, oh, they come to school here, like they're in this class with me, but they're not like me. If you do it the other way I just described, it really helps change the culture, and it helps change the culture for those kids as they move in age through middle school and high school. And that's where we really need to improve things, isn't it? As kids are trying to find themselves, and they're more outspoken and sometimes don't think before they speak and all kinds of things like that, or act. So I think that's one thing I wanted to bring up in terms of that is how do you change the culture? Well, I think we have to start early and try prevention. There's lots of other ways, including mediation, including, that we talk about in the special ed community, parents, the teachers, we're all familiar with, let's get a lunch group, let's get a small group to teach social skills. But I think that we don't think about, and we should, what about typically just developing students? They could use a social group too, to learn things they're not learning anywhere else, or learn acceptance and learn like when not to say things or who to ask for information. Anyway, I think I better stop there. I'll just keep rambling, but that's my first thoughts to that question.
I agree with what Steve said. I've always found early intervention is the key. It's a lot easier to modify the behavior or modify what a 6-year-old does than a 16-year-old who's more set in their ways. I think also the other issue is that what Steve said about visible versus invisible. People see a kid in a wheelchair, they see a blind kid, they generally understand they're disabled. However, a lot of people see autism, ADHD, mental health, and they're like, you're not disabled, you're not in a wheelchair. I've had people say that to me, you're not disabled, you're not in a wheelchair. And they see disability as you have to be, as I always say, blind, deaf, or in a wheelchair, or missing a limb. If you're not one of those things, they don't see you as disabled. So a lot of it is changing a perception. Most kids are not going to think, oh, let's take the kid in the wheelchair's wheelchair away because that'll be funny. People don't do that nowadays, but they think, oh, well, this kid is autism. That's not a real disability, so I can make fun of him for his social awkwardness or for his not understanding social cues. The whole he thinks they're laughing with him and they're really laughing at him.
Yeah, I'm glad that you both brought up this prevention and education, especially, and I don't think it's off track at all. In fact, we had a few questions about this from people registering. So a couple were pretty specific, like someone was asking, how would you help students to accept students whose behavior is different or could be perceived as scary, like more of a student with emotional regulation disability who might scream or throw things or be more explosive? How would you help students, or how could educators help students with this understanding? Maybe we could start with Steve for that one.
Yes, thanks. I think there are two different things in that question. The I'm blanking out, Amanda, you'd read it. Just read it again. That one part about,
How would you help students to accept other students who
Yep.
have these behaviors, especially if they're more kind of scary or emotional outbursts and things like that?
right, thank you. So accepting, I think I think that's easily remedied if you just teach people. That's what I try to do with parents all the time, is try to expose them to information rather than me just telling them what to do in terms of advocacy. I try to expose to them where they can read the regulations or where I can explain them to them so they understand what we're advocating for within what framework. So I think to get educated, we just have to have good information to share with the students. I think it's a different thing to say, well, if a typically developing peer witnesses let's say an upsetting event by a child with a disability, like that, it's just upsetting. That it's just, maybe no one was targeted, but if you've ever seen somebody have kind of a mental break, kind of a disconnect. There's a clinical term I'm not remembering right now. Forgive me for that. But that can be really upsetting. So a kid that's had trauma when they were very young and they're still dealing with that, they have PTSD perhaps. And if they could be really disconnected, and that can be very bizarre and very upsetting for anybody, and especially a teenager. So I think you could share information, but to process those feelings the typical student is having, that's a little more involved. And I think that some families afterwards, maybe the disabled student that had this breakdown is interested in connecting with their peers, is interested in kind of teaching their peers. Well, I think you could have a conversation. The social worker could talk with both students or whatnot, or talk with the students that witness this with the disabled student with them, with their permission, of course, and kind of just talk about it. Or maybe I'm not a social worker, but I've been around a lot of them. And I think maybe if you just have a discussion without betraying the disabled students' rights or information, but if three of you witness the same thing in the same room and you want to talk about it, let's talk about it. Why don't you just share? And the social worker can kind of guide that if it gets in the wrong direction about personal stuff or whatnot. But I think they're two different. Does that make sense, that they're processing your feelings about it and your emotions is very important, but it's different than how do you learn about it, I think.
That's been consistent with what districts have done, where we've had a student who's had, essentially a significant meltdown, sometimes to the point where the class has to be, evacuated, and because we can't safely remove that student, and having an audience sometimes can exacerbate the circumstances. And then when the student is gone and the other kids come back, they're kind of like, what happened? Where do I go from here? And that's where, sometimes we've had the school counselor come down and just sort of help them process through that feeling and emotion. Whether or not the parent of the child who had that, meltdown is going to be particularly comfortable having a group discussion with their child, relating what happened, is going to depend upon the parent and the student and their age. But regardless, I think that there can be a productive conversation that, yes, that was distracting, and it did, we had to leave, but understand, I'm sure that this was a tough situation for him. And when he comes back, he's going to feel a little bit off or embarrassed. So we need to remember he's our friend. Let's, be prepared to welcome him back. And it may not be a good time to, immediately talk about it. But, if after a while you want to talk about it, or you want to talk about it with him, maybe I can have that meeting with you and we can have that conversation to give kids constructive guidance as to how to repair and remediate, because a lot of times they don't know. And when the kid comes back, they're going to be like, why did you do that? And then the student can become immediately, escalated again. Whereas if you understand, think about it, that might be a tough thing to come back in after. If you realize that you may, and sometimes they they get that they went over the edge, but they couldn't reel it back in at that time because, the genie was out of the bottle. Being able to, have the school, the class understand when the kid comes back, it may not be the best time to process it with that student because they may have just gotten control. So maybe it's a discussion we have at another time, but giving the rest of the team, of the kids, the opportunity to just kind of share their concerns so that we can move past that and it doesn't just sort of hang out there like, pretend that didn't happen. That's never going to happen. Kids aren't going to, that doesn't get deleted in their mind. But giving them something constructive as to how to manage it, and then potentially offering solutions as to how you can work through those concerns at a later point is helpful. Because failing to address that is when we have kids go home and say to the parents, this child went and was screaming and yelling and da-da-da, and we all had to leave the class and we couldn't even continue. And the parents are like, what happened? Why did I get a call? Like, this sounds like a serious incident. And, that information may not be getting translated to the child. And again, it may have been 30 seconds, but in the life of a kid, that's, that's like all day we had to leave the class. And it's like, well, maybe not, but, processing it so that they know what happened and also maybe deciding what information can be related out. I have had incidents where the district has related that there was a significant situation that occurred. Your children may have questions, please direct them to so-and-so, the counselors are available, without disclosing the name of the person or the student who had the episode, because we also have to be mindful of protecting their confidentiality and their rights.
And I think, adding to what Steve said, I think very often Steve mentioned trauma. Bullying can lead to lifelong trauma, as we've seen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly piggyback, Tara, on what you said about the student returning usually feels badly. I might be paraphrasing, and they absolutely do. And even as they're older, depending upon the disability, it doesn't, like, it's not like, I think it's a great opportunity when you can to teach the typically developing students that this is not a shameful thing. It's a disability, and it manifests behaviorally sometimes, but it doesn't mean that the student or the person has 100% control over it. And that's the tricky part with mental health or other behavioral things, but it's really important. And it's really important to recognize that none of these students want to come back after that. Like, they might, and they have other, they will often, but they do not feel like it because they're just embarrassed and sick about it, regardless of how anyone else feels about it. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, kids are more accepting. The parents oftentimes are where we struggle. And I get it. Their concern is, how can this happen in the class? How do I know my child is safe? Once we're through the crisis, the safety issue is resolved. The discomfort we have is sometimes a matter of not understanding disabilities and not understanding that, we are an inclusive programming. We do have a lot of children with disabilities who, years gone by might have been in segregated or separated settings. To me, I think it's a benefit that we have more inclusion for all students with disabilities with their non-disabled peers, but that also does require, some adaptation to what we expect and also how we recover from, tough moments like that, because there are some things that kids might not ordinarily have seen.
And I think the world is tougher now with COVID. It has really changed the game. So many kids, as people have said, kids and adults, our society as a whole, social skills have deteriorated somewhat with being so virtual. One of my friends commented, we've all lost some social skills not being around people for over a year. And I think then you get into the kids with immunocompromised systems. And as we know, parents have different opinions. If you turn on the news, I feel like every night I turn on the news, I see a parent somewhere in this country screaming at a school board. So that raises the issue that no matter what you do, you're going to have some parent angry.
Yeah, and I think that, one interesting thing I've noticed with COVID is that I do think it raised a greater degree of awareness for people about the impact of health and wellness and anxiety and mental health issues. It is a much more common conversation than it has ever been before, because I agree with Steve, sometimes people see mental health issues as shameful. Don't talk about it, don't acknowledge it, just ignore it. And if that's the mentality that no one's able to comfortably discuss it, then, how can we change the culture? How can we change that conversation? And when, people like Simone Biles, put mental health first, and, that becomes like an example, that this can happen to anyone. This can happen to even, an Olympic athlete. And it's not a surprise that it can happen to kids.
Or
It's a
Prince
question
Harry.
of helping
Prince
us
Harry.
come back from that.
Prince Harry. Look at someone who was born to wealth, privilege, the royal family. He's been very open about mental health.
Yeah.
Great. Great information. So while we're on this sort of education and awareness, I wonder if we could go to Steve and ask about what resources and supports do you find most helpful for parents of students with disabilities who are concerned about bullying?
That is a great question. The first resource, Tara mentions it if you read through the bios, that she's a member on the executive council of and the governing council, also of the Special Ed Task Force. So I'm not good at multitasking here, and people can read the chat, but I'm going to tell you the website for the Special Ed Task Force. I'm going to explain a few things there. So it's www.ny special-ed, just ed, taskforce.org. Now, when you go there, I wrote this down so I wouldn't.
Thank you, Amanda.
When you go, it's in there. Thank you. So when you go there at the top of the page, there's resources. If you click on resources and go to that page, this is a stereotypical phrase, but there's a wealth of information. But one of the things there's two things I want to highlight. One, in general, to empower especially families and parents and students, special ed in plain language. A great booklet. I forget if it's 90 or 100 pages. It kind of tries to simplify the state regulations on special education. They're the Part 200s and the Part 201s, which are related. There we go, which are related to Discipline 201. So that's a great thing. But if you scroll a little further down on that page of resources, there is there's another
students with disabilities.
Yes, there's another booklet, Bullying and Students with Disabilities. So that is a great resource. It also is a great definition. So I remember earlier in the we were talking, I think Amanda had mentioned it. Someone had said, the school tell us, well, that's not really bullying. Well, there you go. So if you have this booklet, it'll tell you what's considered bullying, and you don't have to use it to go back to the school person and say, ha, you were wrong. This is bullying. That is not the way I would put it. But you could go back to them and say, I'm a little confused, whether it be an email or a phone call, a little confused. I have this booklet, which is based on the law that reads that this is bullying. This teasing is actually defined as bullying. So maybe we could talk about that. I don't understand. So anyway, those are great resources there alone. I quickly want to reference someone in signing up for this workshop today asked about how do I talk about my bullying experiences and where do I do that? So specifically to parents, I don't know about the students right now, but there's a lot, number one, I would go to any group that is specific to the disability you're with. So for example, NAMI is a National Alliance of Mentally Ill. There's the Autism Society. And then there's I know there's support groups for every disability, or at least information for every disability out there. So if your child or you have that disability, you probably are more aware than I am of what is out there. And I would look for groups there. I would also suggest and challenge parents and providers to start a support group just for your community, perhaps. There is a certain science to doing them. Talk to your local social worker. They probably have good ideas about it, or reach out to me. I've run support groups before. There are certain things you do want to do and certain that you don't, but mostly that can be a very safe place. And they're not, in spite of what I just said, it's not rocket science to do a good support group. It really isn't. So I would suggest that as well. There's a few other resources. I don't know if I want to run through them all, but I'll take 20 seconds. In New York State, Families Together, New York State, and Parent to Parent is a state organization. Those are just two that also popped into my head that I written down I wanted to mention. But there's plenty of resources out there, and if I can be of help to help wherever you are finding one, I don't know if our contact info will be out there, or reach out to Amanda and she'll put you in touch with me, and I'll be glad to help you out.
And I want to just add, Steve's right about the plain language, because as Tara said recently, we get lost in a sea of acronyms that lay people who don't do this every day don't understand. And we sometimes forget that not everybody knows these acronyms.
Yeah. Wonderful. I know Tara had mentioned yesterday when we were planning stopbullying.gov as well as, that's our national body that has a wealth of resources about bullying. And I see that that Bree also put in the chat, thank you, the End Abuse website, which the Alberti Center actually created with funding from the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. So a lot of resources and support tools for advocacy in that too, as well as our Alberti Center resources.
Yeah, I recommend and again, the Alberti sources are fantastic. The one thing I did like about stopbullying.gov is that they include a lot of different materials that are designed for every possible age audience. So there's like comics for younger kids. There's more, teen oriented. And I think that sometimes people are like, well, I want to teach about bullying and how to address this, but I don't know how to target the right audience. And that, does have a variety of different strategies for different levels.
Thank you. And just one more I want to add, those that are Alberti Center faithful followers know that we've actually had PACER's National Bullying Prevention Center. Julie Herzog came in and presented, but they are also a national organization for advocacy for disabilities, but also specifically focus on bullying prevention, which is great. So a couple more questions. I see that we are getting close to time, but I think we've gotten to almost all the questions that were submitted, which is great. One that we haven't gotten to yet was someone asked, what is the biggest misconception with regards to the bullying of students with disabilities?
I'll let Tara start because I want to think about my answer.
I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is either it does or it doesn't happen. And there's two different schools of thought. Some say it never happens, it's all in their mind or in their perception, and that's not accurate. And some says it's always happening, and kids are not always the nicest, but that doesn't mean everything they do is automatically bullying. It really comes down to looking at the particular instances. Example being, if a student invites a couple of their friends from class to attend a birthday party, but don't extend the invite to everyone, it might not be nice not to have been invited, but was that particularly exclusion, not if they didn't invite the whole rest of us. If you were the only one not invited, then that might, cross into the, that was a targeting type situation. So there's a lot of, perspective and context that does relate to what we go. But I think that really the biggest thing is that, people aren't willing to act upon harassment or discrimination or bullying. And, the biggest problem that districts often have is that it's not reported. And sometimes parents are like, well, my child's not comfortable or doesn't feel like anything will happen. And, the district can only intervene and intercede if we know what's going on. And, and the second part is it sometimes does take a little bit of time to get through that process. But I go back to my original point at the beginning. One of the best things the district can do is put in immediate interim measures to address those immediate concerns for the student while the investigation goes on. That one helps parents feel like, okay, you've seen and you understand, and my child has now got some additional safety plan, a contact person, an emergency path, or something to help them. And then two, I also know that you're working on the investigation, so it's going somewhere. And I think that communication piece, the failure to have it can really stymie the relationship between parents and the faith they have in, the district is actually acting upon something.
Well, and I would add two misconceptions I realize. One is that bullying has to be physical. Some people believe it's only physical and don't realize verbal abuse that counts as bullying. Verbal taunting, making fun, teasing. I've seen school districts where they will say, "Oh, they're just boys being boys." I had a case where the kids were slapping each other in the necks, and they said, "Oh, that's what the boys do. They smack each other's necks." And of course, you're talking preteen boys smacking each other. It gets out. Of course, it eventually gets out of hand.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think a misconception is that children with disabilities sometimes, and I see this with kids with autism, don't have feelings, don't have empathy. There's this misconception that kids with autism don't actually, feel it. So I think that's another misconception.
Thank you. I think I'm going to end on this question. With what can schools do when it comes to more subtle discrimination against people with disabilities? So this person was specifically talking about microaggressions, which we know there actually doesn't even have to be intentionality behind it. It could be seemingly otherwise nice people, having these digs, having these micro insults or aggressions. And of course, that's for disabilities as well as, people from other minoritized backgrounds. So I wonder if the panel has thoughts about that.
I think that is really hard. I've taken just recently a training on microaggressions, and I think that I think it was great, and I have a lot of growth to do based on that, and so do a lot of my friends and family and peers. So I think prevention and changing culture is the way to go on. That's how I would look at that, because I think it's hard to kind of trying to pick it out and say, oh, that was a microaggression, and let's discuss it. Like a lot of times we don't realize it. So we have a ways to go a little bit before we start addressing it for ourselves, let alone for others. Not saying we shouldn't, just saying that might not be the best starting point for the purview of what we're discussing today. But I do think we're really working towards doing a great job in terms of inclusion of students with disabilities and integration, including, the model of co-teach classrooms. I don't know if that's called that everywhere, but ideally having half the class with disabled students, half with typical students, have a special ed regular teacher. It's a special ed model, but that's a real good benefit for the regular ed students as well. So I think we have to look at prevention and culture to address that as best we can and try to get a lot of ground gained in times to come.
I want to add to what Steve said. I think there is something to be said for the intersection of other identities, racial, gender, sexual orientation. Those all play into disability. I remember when I was a child being Jewish, kids would sometimes throw pennies at me and say pennies for the Jew, which is obviously very anti-Semitic. And with my own undiagnosed Asperger's, I might have reacted more strongly than another Jewish kid in terms of how I handled it. But, there's this intersection of these things that we see all the time on the news where you don't handle it as well as someone else might have because you're disabled, but they're attacking you because you're Black, because you're Jewish, because you're gay. Like I said, I was being hit with pennies and I didn't know how to handle that at 6, 7 years old. And, it comes to the question of who's teaching kids that that's okay to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I do find that sometimes the microaggressions that we deal with at school often are the kids mirroring attitudes and comments that they've heard at home. And that's very difficult because when we say, that's not appropriate, and they're like, well, that's what mom and dad said, it's difficult because it's not just, we can change the culture at school, but we need to have a community, based cultural change, because if we all come to the understanding that these are our social mores, these are what we consider acceptable and what we want for our environment, then we can all, lean into that. But if we don't have that agreement, it is very difficult because sometimes kids don't even know what they're saying or how they're saying it. They're just repeating what they heard. And so they don't understand that, what it meant. Like I had a situation where we had a kindergartner who came in after apparently watching a Trump rally of some sort, and came in the next day and said to a child of Latinx descent, I hear that you're going to have to leave school tomorrow because I guess all of you guys have to go. And, you know, the other little kid understood it to be a diss, but it was, you know, the kid who said it really didn't, he just was like, I guess you're leaving. Everyone's leaving. Isn't that the way, you know? So he wasn't saying it meanly, but it was what he was hearing, and it was his take of the news. And so he shared it, and, you know, obviously the impact was different. I'm still on a call right now, sorry. The impact was still different. And, you know, it's hard because it's not just what we can teach them at school, it's also what they pick up in the world, and trying to make sure that we're all aiming towards a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
And the problem, I think, is like what Tara was just describing. I think if you raise the issue that, you know, you're contradicting what their parents tell them, then you get angry, pissed off parents coming into the school. And again, going back to what I said earlier, school, you have these people, you turn on the news every day and you see some parents somewhere in the country shouting at the school board.
Right. And I think this is a perfect time for us to end on that. It really takes all of our efforts. Thank you again so much to our panelists. You have offered a wealth of information. I could stay on for 2 more hours, but I'm going to release our participants here. Bree went ahead and put a certificate of attendance in the chat, and we'll also be sending up a follow-up email. But again, Tara, Michael, and Steve, your expertise, your work, your generosity with your time is so appreciated. And all who attended and who submitted questions and are dedicated to this work, we thank you as well.
Thank you for the opportunity.